High on a mountainside in Asia Minor, there is a rock formation that, seen from a certain angle and in a certain light, resembles the weeping face of a woman, and the local springs that trickle down its stone are said, in the old story, to be her endless tears, still falling. The poets tell us, even now, however many thousand years after the grief that first carved them. This is the story of how a proud and happy mother, blessed with more children than almost any woman in these old tales, came to be that mountain, turned to stone not by any monster or any curse laid upon her from outside, but by the simple and unbearable weight of a grief she brought entirely upon herself. Tonight we follow Niobe, whose pride in her own good fortune could not resist comparing itself to the gods, and who learned, in the space of a single terrible afternoon, exactly what it costs a mortal to make that particular comparison out loud. And we begin, fittingly enough, with a family already marked, before Niobe herself was ever born, by exactly this same fatal flaw. Niobe was the daughter of Tantalus, and if that name is already familiar to you, it should be, for we have told his story before on this channel, in the long retelling of the Greek underworld and the punishments reserved there for the very worst offenders against the gods. Tantalus, you will recall, had once been so favored by Olympus that he was invited to dine at the table of the gods themselves, and repaid that extraordinary honor with a betrayal so monstrous that his name became, for all the centuries that followed, a byword for the cruelest possible abuse of divine trust, and for his crime he was condemned to stand forever in a pool of water beneath branches heavy with fruit, tormented eternally by a hunger and a thirst that could never once be satisfied, the food and the water drawing endlessly back just beyond his reach. It is worth remembering that punishment now, at the very start of his daughter's own story, because Niobe inherited far more from her father than simply her royal blood. She inherited, it seems, something of his same fatal confidence, the same dangerous belief, passed down quietly through a single bloodline, that extraordinary good fortune somehow entitled a person to stand closer to the gods than the ordinary rules of mortal humility allowed. Niobe herself had married well and risen high, becoming queen of Thebes, the very city, this channel has already told you, founded by Cadmus out of a hopeless search and a dragon's sown teeth, as the wife of Amphion, a gifted musician whose lyre, the old stories say, could move stones themselves to build the very walls of the city he ruled, a fitting talent for a king whose own wife would one day, in her turn, be moved into stone by grief rather than by music. Together, Niobe and Amphion had been blessed, by any ordinary measure of fortune, with an extraordinary family. 14 children in all, 7 strong and beautiful sons, and 7 equally lovely daughters, a household so full of healthy and thriving life that Niobe had every reason, by the standards of her own time and place, to consider herself among the most fortunate women who had ever lived. And for a long while, this fortune brought her nothing but genuine and understandable joy. It was only when that joy curdled, slowly, and then all at once, into something far more dangerous, that her story began its long slide toward tragedy. The occasion that finally set the catastrophe in motion was a religious festival, one held annually in Thebes, in honor of the goddess Leto, mother of the twin gods Apollo and Artemis, and on the appointed day, the women of the city gathered as they always did, dressed in ceremonial laurel, to make their offerings and their prayers to a goddess whose own 2 children, Apollo and Artemis, were counted among the most powerful and most dangerous of all the Olympians. Niobe, watching the procession of worshippers, moving past her own palace toward Leto's altar, felt something rise in her that she could not, in the moment, bring herself to suppress. An indignation, dressed up as simple pride, that so much honor should be paid to a goddess who had, after all, borne only 2 children, when she herself, a mortal queen, had borne 14, 7 times as many, each one of them, in her own estimation, at least as beautiful and as accomplished as anything the gods themselves could claim credit for. And so Niobe did the one thing that, across every single story we have followed on this channel, has never once gone unpunished by the gods of Olympus. She spoke her comparison aloud, publicly, in front of the very worshippers gathered to honor Leto's festival, interrupting the sacred procession to ask with a scorn she did not trouble to hide why the women of Thebes should bow before a goddess with only 2 children when their own living queen stood before them with 14. She catalogued her own advantages without restraint, her wealth, her royal blood, her husband's gift for music, and above all, again and again, the sheer abundant number of her children, each point delivered as though it constituted an argument that Leto herself, standing invisible somewhere beyond the mortal world, could not possibly answer. "Stop this worship," she told the astonished crowd, "and honor me instead, for I have given the world 7 times what the goddess has, and my good fortune is not likely to fail, however Leto's own children might one day disappoint her." It is worth sitting, for a moment, with exactly what made this outburst so much more dangerous than an ordinary mother's understandable pride in her own large and thriving family. Niobe was not simply happy about her children, which would have been a perfectly ordinary and forgivable feeling for any parent to hold quietly in her own heart. She made her happiness into a weapon and aimed it directly at a goddess, converting a private joy into a public claim of superiority over an immortal power whose own 2 children happened, as it turned out, to be 2 of the most fiercely protective and most lethally accurate archers in the entire Greek pantheon. Leto, hearing this insult carried up to her on Olympus, did not need to raise her own hand in retaliation at all. She simply went to her 2 children, Apollo, god of the sun and of the plague-bearing arrow, and Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon, and told them plainly what had been said about her in the very city built to honor her, and asked nothing more of them than the ordinary and expected loyalty any child owes a parent who has been publicly humiliated. And Apollo and Artemis, understanding immediately and completely what their mother required of them, descended together from Olympus to Thebes, and found Niobe's 7 sons out on the plain beyond the city, engaged in exactly the kind of vigorous and cheerful exercise that 7 healthy young princes of that age would naturally have been engaged in. Some racing their horses, some wrestling, some practicing with their spears. The whole scene, by every old telling, one of ordinary and untroubled youthful vitality, with no warning at all of what was about to fall upon it out of a clear sky. Apollo, whose arrows, this channel has already noted in an earlier story, could carry plague and death across an entire army when his anger was roused, began to loose those same arrows now, one after another, each shot finding its mark with a god's own perfect and merciless precision. And one by one, Niobe's 7 sons fell where they stood or rode or wrestled, cut down, before any of them fully understood what was happening, or from where the killing blow had come. The old poets, telling this part of the story, do not rush past the horror of it, and it is worth letting their unhurried grief guide us here, rather than moving too quickly to the story's larger lesson. One son fell from his racing horse, struck mid-stride, the animal running on riderless, while its master lay dying in the dust behind it. Another, seeing his brother already fallen, tried desperately to shield a third with his own body, and was struck through both of them together, so that a single arrow claimed 2 lives meant, in that instant, to protect each other. A messenger, the old tellings say, ran back to the palace in a panic to bring Amphion the news, and the king, hearing that his sons were dying one after another on the plain outside his own walls, took up his own sword in a father's helpless grief and rage, and, unable to reach the gods who were actually responsible, and unable to bear the unfolding slaughter he could do nothing to stop, turned that sword upon himself, ending his own life before the full and final horror of that single afternoon had even finished unfolding. Niobe, receiving this same news, could not yet believe that all 7 of her sons were truly gone, and in her disbelief and her desperate remaining pride, she made a claim that the old poets clearly meant us to hear as the story's cruelest and most bitter irony. Even now, she declared, even with 7 sons taken from her in a single afternoon, she remained more fortunate than Leto, for she still had her 7 daughters left to her, and 7, she insisted, even after such a loss, was still more than the goddess's own 2. It is a claim that reveals, with an almost unbearable clarity, exactly how completely her pride had blinded her, even to the scale of the grief already breaking over her. A mother standing over the bodies of 7 murdered sons, and still, in that very moment, reaching for one more comparison to hold up against a goddess who had already demonstrated, beyond any possible doubt, exactly how far she was willing to go to answer such comparisons. Artemis, hearing of this final and defiant boast, did not hesitate to complete what her brother had already begun. She turned her own arrows upon Niobe's 7 daughters, and one by one, exactly as their brothers had fallen. On the plain outside the city, the girls fell as well, some of the old tellings say within the walls of the palace itself, cut down in their own home, with no plain or open field to offer even the illusion of somewhere safer to run. Only the very youngest, by some versions of the tale, was spared at the last possible instant, Niobe clutching her final surviving child so desperately close that even Artemis, for one brief and merciful moment, held back her final arrow, though other and darker tellings insist that no exception was made at all, and that every single one of Niobe's 14 children, sons and daughters both, died that same terrible afternoon, so that a woman who had once boasted of being 7 times more blessed than a goddess found herself, by nightfall, with nothing left at all. Sit with the full weight of that reversal for a moment, because it is the whole and deliberate architecture of this particular myth. Niobe's crime was comparison, the belief that abundance, measured simply in numbers, could be weighed against the gods and found to tip the scale in a mortal's favor. And her punishment was constructed, with a precision that borders on the mathematical, to answer that exact comparison in the cruelest possible coin. She had claimed superiority through quantity, and the gods, in response, did not merely humble her. They reduced her, methodically and completely, back down past equality with Leto's own 2 children, all the way down to nothing at all, for by the time Apollo and Artemis were finished, Niobe, who had once stood before the whole city boasting of 14 living children against a goddess's mere 2, was left with none. What followed for Niobe was a grief so total, so far beyond any ordinary capacity for mourning, that the old poets could not describe it in the language of ordinary human sorrow at all. She sat among the bodies of her 14 children for 9 full days and nights, The old tellings say, without eating, without sleeping, without moving, from where her grief had rooted her, while the gods themselves, in some versions of the story, prevented anyone from properly burying the dead until the 10th day, as though even in her devastation, some further and final indignity still had to be added to the weight of what she had already lost. And when at last some feeling other than raw grief finally moved through her again, it was not remorse, and it was not any late understanding of the pride that had brought all of this down upon her family. It was simply exhaustion, so complete and so absolute that it seemed to pass beyond the normal boundary between a living, feeling woman and something else entirely. She fled from Thebes, unable to remain in the city where all 14 of her children now lay dead, and made her way back to her own homeland, to Mount Sipylus in Asia Minor, where she had been born. And there, on that mountain's side, overcome at last by a sorrow too vast for any living body to continue carrying, she was transformed into stone. The old poets tell it almost as a mercy, as much as a punishment, by this point in the story, as though the gods themselves, having already exacted every measure of retribution her pride had earned, allowed her this final transformation, not as further cruelty, but simply as the only fitting shape left for a grief that had already outgrown every ordinary human capacity to bear it. Turned entirely to rock, she stood motionless upon the mountainside, and yet even as stone, the old tellings insist, she did not stop weeping. Water still trickles from that rock formation. To this very day, the story tells us, the endless tears of a mother who lost everything in a single afternoon, still falling, long after the woman who once wept them had turned entirely to unfeeling stone around them. There is a particular and quietly devastating detail worth adding here before we let this story close, because it completes the circle the myth has been drawing all along, back to the very father we began with. Niobe, remember, was the daughter of Tantalus, whose own punishment in the underworld left him standing forever in reach of food and water he could never actually touch, tormented eternally by an appetite that could never be satisfied. And here, generations later, was his own daughter standing forever upon a mountainside, endlessly weeping tears that could never actually ease her grief, an eternal outpouring with no relief built into its own design, any more than her father's endless hunger had ever once been allowed to end. The particular shape of both punishments, father and daughter alike, seems to insist on the same terrible lesson passed down across an entire bloodline. That pride which reaches too far past the ordinary boundaries the gods have set for mortals does not simply earn a single sharp correction and then release its victim back into ordinary life. It earns instead an eternity, a wound or a weeping or a hunger that time itself is never quite permitted to close. And so we return at the end to the question this long and sorrowful story was quietly built to ask. What is it, exactly, that makes ordinary happiness so dangerous to speak aloud in comparison to what the gods themselves possess? Niobe's children were real, and her love for them was real, and her pride in their number and their beauty was, in itself, no crime at all. Every parent in every age has felt some version of that same fierce and boastful love for their own children, and the story does not ask us to condemn her simply for feeling it. What destroyed her was not the love, but the comparison, the decision to hold her own good fortune up against a goddess's, and declare, publicly and without humility, that mortal abundance could outweigh divine favor. It is a warning this channel has circled before, in different shapes and different heroes, but rarely delivered with such total and mathematical precision as here, where a boast of 7 times greater fortune was answered, point for point, until nothing at all remained standing where 14 children had once run and laughed across a sunlit plain. Rest now. Let the old mountain settle into its long silence, its slow tears still tracing the same worn paths down weathered stone. And let whatever pride you carry into your own life tonight rest a little more gently, a little more quietly than a mother's did, on a plain outside Thebes so very long ago.